Okay, so today's guest on the Keen Yoga podcast is Rodney Yee. I'm actually really super pleased to have you here, Rodney. Welcome to the Keen Yoga podcast.
Thank you, Adam. Nice to
Yeah,
be here.
yeah. Especially as there's really not that many interviews with Rodney around, so we're hoping to get a good one today. And I have to admit, like looking back, like maybe kind of 25 years, I do remember seeing your Gaiam videos, and yeah, I was very kind of impressed by the kind of shapes and the kind of visual of it at the time. So personally, I'm kind of very flattered to be talking to Rodney now. But I don't know much about your yoga journey actually, Rodney, at all. I mean, I have heard how you started, but if you don't mind for the listenership to just to give a basic recollection of how you got into yoga in the first place.
Wonderful, Adam. Let's see if I can remember that far back. 1980, I was a philosophy major at University of California, Berkeley, and also I was a ballet dancer for the Oakland Ballet. Upstairs from our studio, our dance studio, there was some Iyengar yoga going on with a wonderful teacher called Donald Moyer and Melinda Purley. So what happened was I was a very tight dancer, and I thought, oh, those yogis, they seem to be quite flexible. So I went upstairs with a friend, and we could emulate the poses pretty easily, as dancers. And so I came downstairs afterwards with my buddy David Lee, and we were walking down the sidewalk, and we both looked at each other and said, "How do we feel this good?" And we couldn't believe how clear and open and present we felt from that single class. And of course, as dancers, we had been doing all kinds of shapes and rhythms and forms, and nothing with that kind of effect. And so I was a once a week yogi basically upstairs as I was a dancer. And then I went to Japan to dance for the Matsuyama Ballet Company of Tokyo in 1981. And fortunately, one of the dancers in the company was a yogi. So I copied him on the side. We had, as people may or may not know, there's a lot of time in rehearsals to sort of just do whatever, read a book, knit, wear, or do yoga. So that sort of was the continuation. There was at the time a Japanese man who had some affiliation with BKS Iyengar in Tokyo. And there's all kinds of little history there, but I won't go into that. But I was fortunate to study under a wonderful dancer, yoga teacher in Japan. Coming back, I knew my dance career was going to be limited and short. And so coming back, I started studying Iyengar yoga, really at the yoga room at Berkeley. And that's when I met Richard Rosen, who introduced me to you.
Yeah.
And him and I started going to the San Francisco Iyengar Institute in about 1983. And was just both of us were just so happy with the level of instruction. Because I was also studying physical therapy in the UC system, I had not really encountered in my life this kind of sort of expertise to the human body. And I felt, wow, a whole new doorway has opened to me to sort of understand myself in many different levels, both philosophically, intellectually, physically, emotionally. I felt like, wow, something here has to be investigated. So studies became pretty fervent at that time. And Richard and I were pushing each other along with a number of other colleagues. So in the 80s, I had the fortune, Patabi Joyce came over, to San Francisco in 1985, studied for about 7 days of intense study there at a small studio in San Francisco. But basically, I was a Iyengar yoga practitioner all through the 80s with then Manusa Manos and then Ramanand Patel. Richard Rosen and I sort of made the journey together. We kept on sort of, I would say, not progressing, but changing teachers that seemed to fit uh, the quest that we were looking into at the time.
Mm.
Um, we started the Piedmont Yoga Studio in 1987 with a fellow colleague, Claire Finn. And we were just bumbling along. I mean, we had no idea there was no yoga really, per se, a couple studios here and there. We really, none of us had the intention of making a career out of it, really. There was no such thing. But our interest was really rolling strong. And so we all had the sort of ignorance to just continue to follow our interest. Uh, and I guess the confidence and also just the wherewithal, not, we were working different jobs to make it happen, but we had to study yoga.
Mm.
Um, of course, the Yoga Journal was gathering some speed at the time, and Donald Moyer he was one of the editors. So we both modeled for Yoga Journal. I was in the 1989 and 1991 calendar, Yoga Journal calendar. And then what really took place was there was a man who wanted to start yoga videos with Yoga Journal. His name was Steve Adams. And they asked actually me to put in a videotape. And I remember Richard coming out of the studio saying, "What are you doing, Rodney?" I said, a friend is taping me for some yoga videos for an audition. And he said, "Well, whatever." And fortunately, they called me the day after, and they asked me to shoot a video. And Patricia Walden had already done one in 1989, Yoga for Beginners. And her and I then made a tri-set. I did Yoga for Strength. We both split Yoga for Relaxation, and she did Yoga for Flexibility. And that was my real entrance into making a decent career out of my interest.
Mm. Mm.
Going further on, then probably in 92, 93, 94, Patricia Walden was really shy and I wasn't. So they started putting me as the workhorse on these videos. So over the years, who knows, I must have shot probably over 50 VHS and then DVDs. And I was on Oprah in 1999, I believe, or the year 2000. My memory's failing what year that was. But that sort of catapulted, unbeknownst to me, it sort of catapulted, if you will, the world of yoga in the United States. That we sold 1 million videos the day after I was on Oprah. Studios called me from around the country saying, "Thank you. Our attendance just went up." And so, I got to make a career out of the thing I love.
Mm.
And
Mm.
from there, I moved to be with the one I love, Colleen Sagman, out in Sag Harbor. She has a wonderful studio called Yoga Shanti. And for the last 20 years, Colleen and I have taught together in so many different ways and still really do that. I'm one of her horses at the studio and basically am teaching there live and online. But for the most part, we've just gotten to study and teach.
Mm. Mm. That's brilliant. I just let you go there because that was a really interesting kind of segue into things. And you point out so many interesting things. Like, I mean, yeah, I got into it in late 90s as well. So at that point, we really didn't have the idea that you're going to make money out of it. It was kind of like a thing, kind of almost to do to piss off your parents, or because you weren't, you didn't want to kind of go into the corporate world or something. What were you doing, by the way, in terms of like what job were you doing to cover like if you weren't dancing, just out of interest when
Well, as I was a dancer and a yoga teacher initially in 1985, I was a waiter for a Japanese restaurant and then a really nice little chic restaurant in Berkeley, California. So I was doing the typical waiting tables, doing what I loved. Had no idea other than my friends getting really good jobs coming out of college. I was thinking, well, for the most part, who cares? I just didn't have any sense to like thinking that I had to make a livelihood that would support family and so forth. But
Yeah.
eventually things
It
worked
worked
out.
out. Yeah, yeah, luckily. Yeah, no. I mean, I think you don't when you're young. But I always kind of find it interesting to see what kind of side things people do, did to support their yoga. The other thing that comes to mind immediately is like after that first class, what was so different in the yoga? Since you've been doing all this dancing, and essentially a lot of those movements you would have been doing in dancing are probably more complex than what you would have had in the yoga. You could do them straight away, you said, the asanas. Why was it so different when you had that first experience of going to that yoga class from
Well,
dance?
I think as any pioneer in either the dance or yoga field, what takes place is there's a certain personal internal aspect to the yoga that's different than the dance. I mean, dance, especially in this country, is based on the performing world. So you're actually gearing up to be on stage, even if you're not actually at that level. Uh, the companies and the studios in the world are usually bent in that direction. Also, you're usually dealing with either live music or canned music, for the most part, canned music in practice, and therefore there's a lot less emphasis on sort of an internal rhythm and more like, okay, let's take this shape at this time to this music. The whole movement in yoga, in some ways, towards your own feeling in your body, the breath of the body, the meditation inside the body as sort of a architectural landscape internally is a really different focus. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen at other sports and other art forms. It does. At the best level, that's what does take place. But to be more sort of in the beginning of this art form that sort of took us inwards immediately, uh, how much do we get involved in anything that does that? School is always projected like we're doing that to get somewhere.
Mm.
We're on the road to getting a job. You know, uh, which is amazing. You have to do that. It's important to do that, but not since you were young were you doing something that was really off the landscape of something that was going on inside.
Mm. 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 And you mentioned you're a philosophy major. You always must have had an inquiry basis, like you're interested in thinking kind of more deeply, right? So how did you tessellate? How did you relate your kind of philosophical inquiry into the asana practice? But and this is a double part question, I suppose. How did it relate for you at the start? And more interestingly, how has that developed and how do you see the yoga asana now fitting in with yoga philosophy or the general process of inquiry aims?
First of all, I was very philosophically bent. I remember taking my first philosophy class in my freshman year at college, and it just struck a deep chord of like why. I took the philosophy of law at UC Berkeley, and it was like, why do we create these laws? What are our agreements? Oh, how do we live our best life? What are we here for? The meaning, is there a God? Just a lot of questions that I felt like I wanted to ask and continue to ask. It's not that I was even searching for answers, though I think initially it was, of course, a feeling of settling some big stirring inside my mind and my body and my heart. Also, most of life, even sort of mid high school, started feeling meaningless in some ways. It was like, wow, as most teenagers, very alienated, very isolated, very like, what's it all about? So for me, those questions kept getting stronger instead of weaker. They weren't pushed down by the idea I had to make a living. Um, Not that I was spoiled as a kid. I'm a kid of an immigrant, father and mother from
Mm,
China.
mm,
So it's not that I didn't go without the pressures of like, well, first and foremost, you have to, You have to look out for yourself financially. But there was something much stronger in me. Just basically, I had no choice. People think I'm courageous or, I had a lot of confidence. It was just more of a strong calling, I think. I just couldn't put down these feelings of like, how do we create a better world? Uh, how am I a person in that world that's contributing towards peace, towards humanity? I felt like, just like everybody else, my own personal desires and my own personal wants and needs seem to always dictate my philosophy instead of the other way around. I mean, most people believe in, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not, steal. But most of us do on some level. And so there was a big conflict early on in my life, thinking, oh, I became a vegetarian, blah, blah, blah. I thought, oh, let's leave less impact on the world because things were coming up at the time, even though they're way sort of more in our face these days. They were still, like always, I think, in the history of humanity, really deep questions of, society versus, in some ways, anarchy versus, these not only political stances, but very philosophical, like moralistic, without religion, where do these moralistic codes fit in? And is there a reason for them at all? Are we better off just disbanding this whole notion that there's a better way to be a human being in this world, right? So, anyways, without going too much further than that, philosophers, modern philosophers like Bertrand Russell and so forth, were really hitting me strong. Even books like Hermann Hesse's books, also Siddhartha. I mean, not Zen Buddhism, Suzuki Roshi, even Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance were important books for me in my first years of college. And so to me, yoga, I felt like it lifted a certain inability to live my philosophy. It sort of gave me a hope, if you will, even though I don't even believe in hope as a futuristic, like I'm going to better myself. That's really changed over the years. It's not so much a futuristic endeavor. More of it is a present moment, sort of how can I live right now uh, as my sort of my most authentic self. I mean, I said that sounds so new age, but it sort of comes down to a little bit that. So
Mm.
I feel like the asana and the pranayama practice and the meditation practice are such good tools to, in some ways, unchain the tendencies of myopia that seems to go with desire and aversion. Uh, it's this. It gives you a little bit more time to really respond instead of react as a human
Mm.
being.
Mm. Mm. Fantastically put. I mean, it's kind of very much resonates because I was also a philosophy student and had the same feeling that it was just, I love the philosophy, but somehow there's still a disconnect between that philosophy and actually putting it into practice in daily life before I went to start doing something embodied. So I always kind of play devil's advocate and say, well, why? But obviously I have my own ideas. And I've heard you speak also about things like trying to kind of cultivate the central channel. I heard you mention this idea in your practice. I mean, is that when you're looking at technique or we're asking deeper questions of why in terms of what you're actually trying to do physically and why that might make a difference in your consciousness? Have you got any ideas on that?
I do. I believe there is a movable center. I don't think it's a fixed center. And I think that when one drops into that quiet place, the center of the center of the center, I think what happens is the body of carnation that has taken place, whatever your dharma or your karma is that you were born with, I think for the moment that falls away, it's like shedding skin that has needs propensity survival to it. But I think the center of the center uh, is empty of that color. So I think when they tap into closer to the center, I think they tap into a place where they're not just pushed around by their dharma or their karma or their incarnation. And so I think ironically, I think you're supposed to do both. I think you're supposed to fulfill, as they say, your dharma. You're supposed to fulfill the map of your skin, if you will. But I think you also, in order to do that well, you also have to tap into uh, being in a place where there is no you, where there is actually no dharmic tendency. I think both are simultaneously important and not actually opposed to to fulfilling either
Mm.
one. I think they're important, if you will, uh, opposite sides of the coin that need to weave themselves into every moment.
Mm. Mm. And can that be done through asana at all? I mean, are we talking, is it related to something specific technique that you would look towards informing students in an asana? Or are we looking to asana simply as a means of concentration or, like
No,
practice for, no? Yeah.
consider Zen archery for a moment
Mm.
and taking the power of a bow into the axis of an arrow towards a central target. Okay, so basically, if you think about how you apply force on anything, and if you apply force in the direction of something and find the trajectory of that, and so in asana, let's say the navicular bone of the arches of your feet. When you put your feet together in mountain pose in Tadasana, the two navicular bones, as the keystone of the arches of the instep, connect together. That, in some ways, puts the two halves of the domes of the insteps together. If you take that place and draw it up the axes of the body, you come to a generally right in front of the tailbone, which is sort of the front of the perineum. Well, it's the back of the perineum, really. And then if you guide that somewhat up the back of the diaphragm and then go to the soft palate of the mouth, you get close to some central channel that you can never hold, nor maybe never find. It's elusive, but you can sort of, if you will, vibrate closer to that. So the closer, like if you have a vibration of a string, let's say, that's going back and forth, and as the string settles, or if it's a higher vibration, it begins to vibrate around that central at a higher frequency. So I think basically when you hone your asana practice, you're basically honing into tuning the vibration into a higher frequency around this immutable center. It never can be done, but the frequency gets higher and higher, therefore sort of catapulting you not into your tendency, but in and out of your tendency. And
Mm.
therefore it begins to replicate a quietness that's already there and maybe the essence of you, not the small self, but the big self, that you can then at least get close, as they say in engineering, close enough for practical purposes.
Mm. That's a really good description. And I mean, I was to say, as a kind of funny, I heard you talking elsewhere, and you said, well, the students these days, very few people actually want, you said, I think something like, I shouldn't really say this, but most people don't really want to inquire. I think you said, the students, we don't have the capacity of inquiry anymore, which I think is probably true in the, let's definitely been lessening since the 60s, say. Can we teach this way of looking at asana and simply get the same results, or should there be a context informed around the yoga teaching generally with the teacher informing the students of a certain context?
let me rephrase what you've heard from me, at least,
Yeah, sure. Yeah, please
in
do.
the in the sense that I'm not skeptical at what's happening today. I think, like for instance, my analogy is if you go to Yosemite, most people stay in the valley where all the typical stereotypical sites are: Half Dome, Yosemite Falls. But Yosemite is a big park, actually, and very few people camp outside the valley in the Yosemite Park. But there are a small percentage of people that maybe are rangers at the park or so forth that know the whole park really quite well because they love it, and they are dwelling in that area. Um, I think for the most part, uh, any endeavor is the same. There's going to be people who are just interested in the park, like they're interested in yoga. I don't think this new generation is any different. I mean, there may be more people involved in quote unquote modern 21st century yoga, which may have a certain sort of uh, what we might call superficiality to it. Or let's not even say superficial, because I think that's too much of a judgment. I think more of just a touch to the yoga. Not it's not an in-depth study, but not everybody's a PhD in any subject, right? I mean, so it doesn't mean that it's not important to have all this base of the pyramid of, let's say, of 10 million people, or let's say 100 million people in the world involved in yoga. It's important to have that sort of lower base vibration. In some ways, it helps the professor be a professor. Uh, so it may be much more of a joint effort than we're considering. So everyone adding to that pyramid is important. Uh, so just because you're at the top of the pyramid doesn't mean like, oh, you should look down on the foundation of the pyramid. I think that there's more intricate study happening now just from the sheer numbers of people interested in the subject. There's actually more incredible study happening. I'm going to make a dance analogy because that was my former life. Um, when I was a ballet dancer in the 1980s and the late 70s, uh, when you were a ballet dancer, you were a ballet dancer. You weren't a modern dancer. You weren't a hip hop artist. You weren't a ballroom dancer. Now you check out some of these dancers now. They can do jazz, ballroom, hip hop, you know, uh, ballet, modern in a very sincere way. Like, how do they do it? I mean, and I was just reading a book of physics the other day. It's like a physicist in Einstein's time, they might know that this person's a genius at 19. In today's world of physics, they're not, even at Einstein's level, they're not going to be a genius until they're 45. There's just too much to learn. There's too much that's been discovered in the 20th century. So uh, you have these amazing people doing yoga right now. They speak Sanskrit. They're doing academic studies of the sort of important books of yoga. Yet they also have a stringent and really amazing asana practice and pranayama, and now they're doing meditation forms. Maybe some branches of the tree that sort of branched off away from asana in the whenever the 15th, 16th, 17th century, when just like in Christianity, the body became sort of a pagan endeavor, if you will. This happened around the world. So this new sort of synthesis of saying, wait, we should mind the body, we should mind the mind, we should mind our hearts in a most sincere way to come up with what it means to be a whole human being in the 21st century. And I think that there's a lot of amazing research going on now. So, you also have your Instagram yogi who, we can all make fun of on some level. Even though I wish I could do half those things physically. I mean, let's be honest. Yeah, but who knows who's going to come up with the next evolution of yoga and how that's actually happening. I'm
Yeah.
not going to pretend to be, that sort of godlike to oversee this thing that's got a life of its own.
Yeah, yeah. Nicely put. A nice qualification of a statement to it. I wasn't putting words in your mouth there, but I think it's more like I suppose my leading question would be then, how would you see the problems of the general class currently in terms of what it's giving, and how if you could wave a magic wand, so to speak, and a silly idea really, that how would you change the way that we're presenting yoga to the general public? You know?
Uh,
Or
well,
would you?
that's a wonderful question. I try to do what I believe in my classroom, and so like just like Richard Rosen, we tend to give at this point, even though we were taught not to teach pranayama and asana back to back, because people feel we don't feel like we can affect as many people who are coming to our classroom. We dabble in all aspects. We give a little philosophy, we give a little asana, we give a little pranayama, we do a little meditation, just so it feels like someone at least gets a touch of like, wow, this yoga practice is actually a huge landscape. It's not just like who can put their leg somewhere else. You know, so I think though that anyone, just like you and me, I was interested in putting my leg everywhere too. But after doing that enough, it seemed like, well, even with old age, it's like, well, I better change my goal a little bit. It doesn't seem to be long lasting here. But even so, it feels like, again, like I said, just the general brush and asana. And I don't even mean good technique. And believe me, I pride myself in understanding the human body and understanding what is good technique. Not necessarily safe technique. I do like safe, but I don't like the way safe is being used today. But that's a whole nother podcast. We'll go into just in general here. So, but I like that when people brush into the asana class, I do think even in a bad asana class, something else happens. And I think a door is open. And whether someone wants to walk through that door or not is not up to me. I try to provide, if they do decide to walk through that door, I try to provide teachings that will allow them. And we're getting, like, for instance, in our teacher training right now, that's both online and in person, out of 30 people, we have 15 that are under 30. And they've sought us out. I mean, they can obviously do any teacher training they want, but so that's shocking, and it's partly because Colleen and I have tried to stay relevant, and I mean relevant not in a way of like just selling our souls, but relevant in a way that's like using modern language and using modern sort of like questions, like, what are your questions? Your questions are really the same as mine. They have a different look and feel maybe, but for the most part, the essence is like, even more, I would say the young people are really like questing for meaning. I mean, they're thrown against this wall of, look at the challenges. I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, back in my day, yeah, the environment was, it was coming up. Yes, nuclear holocaust was coming up. But for the most part, it was still a shadow. I mean, these days, these things are like in our face. And these young kids, they're never going to actually have the, if you will, for the most, the wherewithal to sort of outdo us. It was easy for us to outdo our parents, our immigrant parents. They, in their own mind and psychology, they can't in some ways level up to our physical accomplishments that we did in our life. And so they're in this rat race of not knowing and choices and this whole AI world that we only sort of brush, they're sort of immersed in. I mean, I don't understand how they cannot be thrown against philosophy. They have to be thrown against the philosophical wall because there's nothing left.
Do you think we've always been asking for meaning in different ways? Do you see traditional aims of yoga as translating to the current language as no different to traditional aims, or is there been a breach? Are we using yoga in a modern sense in a different way than it traditionally was, or do you think that this is just modern language to ancient questions and the same evolution process keeps rolling?
I would say it's modern language to old questions.
Mm,
I think the evolution of the human being isn't that fast. I think the general physiological feelings inside our body probably haven't changed for 100,000 years. So that's the reason I can read Socrates, Plato, I can read Confucius, I can read, Lao Tzu, I can read the Bhagavad Gita, I can read the Upanishads, and they're still very meaningful. I can read the Bible. They're still very meaningful because they're still dealing with something that's very long time human. So I don't think there's been, even though there's been a huge movement, quick movement in philosophy and sort of the physical technological world of sort of post-industrial age. It's just like in the book Future Shock, we haven't gone that far so far as the human body, the mind, the heart. What we're dealing with, it hasn't changed at all, really.
mm.
So, therefore, no, how can they not be asking the same questions and having the same feelings? They are. I have no doubt in my mind. How they talk about it, I mean, my kids are talking about the woke culture and so forth. It's like, hey, I dealt with racism. I dealt with, the 60s, the 70s of like basically ethnic studies. I've talked about racism my whole life. It's nothing new, but they have a different language that if I don't sort of listen to them and speak their language partly, they dismiss me. And as an older person now, you might be feeling this. You're not quite as old as me, but you get dismissed anyways. And there's some advantages and disadvantages of that. I won't go into, but what I was talking back to loop it back around, our teacher training is half full of below 30.
It's
So
incredible. Yeah, yeah.
they're looking at Colleen and myself and saying, there is someone holding a wisdom stick here that actually has a lot of life experience. And
Mm,
they've been on this path of searching very similar philosophy and a physical realm of how do we get there? How do we synthesize this? All these feelings and thoughts, how do we synthesize? And through the things we're teaching, they're like, just like when we were young practitioners, their light bulbs are going off. They're like, wow. Now, whether or not they can hold on to that way, they have a family and a job and they're like navigating world disaster.
mm.
I don't know. It's a lot to hold on to. But it's not, I don't find any of the things we're talking about, even though it's been part of the wealthy, the people who have leisure time, you know, uh, it's not. It's not class specific or gender specific. We're talking about something that's deep inside our DNA. A search for meaning, a search for well-being, a search for some kind of peace. Uh, Come on, that's. I see my daughters and son talking about this in their own way, without a question.
Mm, mm. I don't take up too much more of your time, but there's a couple of questions I still want to ask. What about just very, very briefly, good technique? You mentioned good technique. Very briefly, what would you say is good technique then in yoga? Yeah, to bring it back to a practical level.
Well, you have two really separate categories in mind of good technique.
Hmm.
One technique is based on the longevity and the ease of the body. Okay. So we're living in a physical body. The physical body is, it seems, very tied, at least in our day and age, tied to the world of physics. Certain joints work in certain ways. They have lever arms, they have cushions, they have strength of muscle, they have integrity. But because we're living in a sitting culture for the most part, the basically levers and joints and muscles of our body are not working very well. They're not, the posture is poor. So the stresses and the tendency of habitual bindings in the body are are simple. Any decent mechanic can look at that if they want and say, oh, this mechanism is going to wear itself out. It's going to be in a lot of pain at a certain amount of time. So you have the mechanics of the physical body and teaching asana in a way that actually allows it to be more at ease most of the time. I'll stop there. I love to go to that subject much deeper. But then you have the technique of what's good for the mind. Like in that case, maybe when the body is really screwed up, maybe it challenges the mind to be okay in really screwed up situations, which means in some ways, if I break your knees in an asana class in India in the 19th century where no one has lawyers and so forth, and no, and your basic guru is saying, oh, deal with your knee, like I've heard of a samurai. We had a sumo wrestler friend in Sag Harbor. He just recently died. They basically, as a 16-year-old, they broke his back, and he was crawling around the zendo with a broken back, couldn't stand up. They didn't care. They're like, deal with it. Like, if you want to be a sumo wrestler, so what? And eventually became one of the great sumo wrestlers, right? Dealt with basically a broken spine, So what kind of tenacity did he have to deal with in his mind? So what in some ways is good mechanics of developing the mind? Well, the door is closed, that no one does that anymore. Like you go to the zendo, you go to the studio, you go to the yoga, and you're like, don't come out until you mastered this pose. Like, if you want me to be your teacher, then I'm your teacher. Deal with it. Psychologically, grow up. Like, deal with it. We don't have that in the West. We don't have that. We're not allowing that in the West. We're all talking about everybody has rights. Everybody has, So in some ways, I hate to say it, we get a little bit weak in our character. It's like we have Gore-Tex now and oxygen, so we're not climbing Mount Everest, barefoot, and developing the acumen, physically to deal with the elements. If you're doing a 30-day meditation and your teacher says, shut up, and like, no, sit down and shut up, and you get hit with a stick, I'm sorry, you have to go through a lot of stuff inside your own body. I'm not advocating, hurting people. I'm just saying that, the mechanics of developing a yoga mind where it's detached from aversion and desire. Where are the mechanics of that? And then the mechanics of the heart. I mean, okay, let's say, Adam, you're going to be celibate for the rest of your life. You're not going to speak for the rest of your life. And you're going to be a monk in this little abbot. So what? Sorry, that's what you are. Deal with it. What's the emotion of that? What's the emotional landscape you're going to have to go through? So we're, and there's always so many exit doors these days and choices that in some ways we never go deep enough to actually jump the hurdle of these things that in order to really become, if you will, samurai yogis or, real yogis that are actually traversing the landscape of renunciation. And I don't mean renunciation. I've come to think of renunciation in a very different way. I'm thinking of renunciation of the small self. So it's not that you renunciate worldly things. You just renunciate anything that has to do with the ego. And that's painful. How are you going to get over that? I can't go over that. I barely scratched the surface. Like barely. I've had a very fortunate life. I've barely scratched the surface. But in everybody's fortunate life, we're still dealing with a lot of the same internal landscapes, are we not? So we all climb Mount Everest regardless. The internal landscape is difficult. All these voices, all this search for peace inside, and yet also the aversion towards peace. We don't want to be peace. Most of myself does not want to be at peace, because peace means the absence of myself. The only thing that's creating no peace is my own resistance. Peace is right there. Peace is happening. I just refuse to sit in it because I'm worried about losing myself.
Mm.
I have to lose myself. I have to be willing to give up myself. It's truly, I have to die, and it's the renunciation of this thing that thinks it's separate. It's a ridiculous. One knows that that's ridiculous. You can't put a long-term bet on something that never stays the same, is always changing, and is always part of the birth and death cycle. It makes zero sense. And yet I'm willing to put all of my life energy into that fallacy.
Mm. As funny as I sit here and reflect, I wouldn't have got all that out of your yoga for strength video. I don't think you covered that in those videos.
No,
Didn't seem to
you
come
know,
across at the time, but it was very pretty. You
uh,
know, I sorry.
no, I believed in asana enough to think that, okay, let's just open this little doorway and find out what happens. It was pretty. The guy who was directing those, we shot on 70 millimeter film, and we were using Hollywood cameras. It was pretty because
Mm,
he wanted to be the best of the best of the film quality, and he wanted to let that get out of the way, if you will, uh, to really deliver just a deep, simple message of like, do these little asanas, feel good.
yeah, no, they're nicely done. Maybe it's duplicating what you just said, but I had this down as a question. What's been your biggest struggle in the yoga, in the broadest context over your lifetime?
I think in the yoga world, there's a lot of lying. There's a lot of falsehood going on. I don't think there's not enough collaboration, because
Mm,
people start getting a place, a soapbox, and then they have to stand on this little, the yogis have been just as fallible to fame and fortune as anybody. So as this thing gained momentum, it actually decreased in collaboration. We don't talk enough. Even at the conferences, the Yoga Journal conferences, it wasn't that easy to, like, except for people you already got along with. It wasn't that easy to really sit down and really push and pull. Like, you hear these old Buddhist debates where people would go at each other, and it would be like a fight to the death. Like
mm,
I don't want yoga to turn into some Olympics, but I want it to be more of like a place where people at least are not hypocrites. At least they're willing to put their, like, why can't I ask, anybody, like, well, what's your definition of Mula Bandha? I mean, really? That's your definition? Like, how is that a definition? Like, engage your Mula Bandha? I mean, like, what does that mean? Like, squeeze something down there. No, it doesn't. Well, I'd like to throw that against the wall, throw the pasta against the wall with my colleagues and say, well, if that's not what it is, well, then what the fuck is it? And it's a little bit like, what have you found out? Throw it against my wall. I'll throw mine against your wall. It's like, when they put together a team to create the, since Oppenheimer's a big film right now, when they put together a team of 19, 20, 30-year olds to create one of the craziest inventions in the world, they put a team together and then just sat them in a room and said, figure this out. It's like, why isn't that happening in the yoga world? Oh, it is a little bit, but for the most part, not everybody's invited to the table, and it's unfortunate. I think we should be sitting. The top 20 yogis of the world should be sitting in a room, trying to hurt each other.
mm.
Like, we should be going at it.
Heard or hurt? No, but you're right. I mean, I think it's obviously it's a commercial business, isn't it? Everyone's protecting their interests. They're selling themselves to the students, and unfortunately, it's sad because it doesn't need to be that way. I mean, I've always tried to operate on the fact that collaboration is even on business terms is better than isolation. You're better off working together, even if you're just looking at it in a commercial venture. But yeah, there's a lot of protectionism, isn't it? And in every field, I'm sure you experience that in Iyengar yoga. I've come from the background of Ashtanga yoga, where it's there in spades. I'm sure you're probably aware of that. And that's a great point. So, Rodney, I don't want to take much more of your time, but actually, I've been super enjoyed this interview. Actually, I really, really, honestly have. We always do this end thing, like asking you for
Yes.
inspiration and a guilty pleasure. Would you just give me an inspiration and a guilty pleasure? And you can't say coffee because I know you like coffee, but you can't say that. You have to something more interesting. Yeah, yeah. I've got you now, haven't I?
Let me
Yeah,
see. Now you took
yeah.
my coffee answer
Yeah,
away.
well, I
Like
saw that Instagram
I,
thing with you and Colleen. Yeah,
I,
yeah.
I'm left now in wandering around, and
All your
my
guilts. Yeah,
my
yeah.
best pleasure actually is wandering around a city with Colleen. I love to wander without schedule, without a reason. I just want to put my body in the world and let it have its own way. That's one of my great. That's not a guilty pleasure, but I'd
Yeah, it's
rather, in
nice.
some ways, not necessarily be working. And like it was even I think Rumi who said, "Oh, I would follow someone who had nowhere to go." Yeah.
Nice.
So
Yeah,
that
yeah.
goes right along with yoga. And then what was the other question? One last thing.
Like an inspiration, something or anything that's really inspired you over the years.
I'm inspired by anyone who's inquiring deeply. Like I love hip hop videos. I think that the real yogis of today are sort of hip hop artists. I think they're exploring their bodies in a real sort of back to the dirt, if you will, back to the sandbox without ideas. I mean, now it's its own culture now, so it's losing that sort of beginner's mind, if you will.
Mm, mm.
But and I also like sort of I'm inspired by the world of physics. They're really trying to push like some unifying idea of the universe, some principles. So I like people who are just like what is this?
Yeah,
and
yeah,
really are trying to push an answer, but they really know they're full of shit. I mean, it's like in the end of the day, it's like, nah, we're not even close, but it's fun.
yeah. Yeah, that comes across in what you say. And yeah, I don't know. I've really enjoyed this for what it's worth, and I think everyone else will too. So thank you for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Very sweet. Thank you, Adam. And Richard was right. You're a wonderful interviewer. Thank you for this time too.
That's very kind. Thank you.